all across history, if you have all these corrupt popes, none of them have ever infallibly claimed something contradictory. Catholics often get trounced by Protestants because they know all their scripture back to front, and we're sort of like, well, was it Matthew or Luke who said that? If you don't know enough to just tell someone the basic arguments for why you believe what you believe, do you actually know enough to say you believe it? It's very easy to object to something than to explain the reason for it.
For sure.
And so if you're not ready for why does God allow evil in the world, then you're going to get stumped, and then you're not going to be able to convince as many people of your position.
Yeah.
All right, episode 6, and it's such a pleasure this episode to have our good friend Chris Fernández here. How are you?
Good, thanks.
And Chris Fernández is the vice captain of a school, and we've known him across a few years. He's been very involved in debating apologetics, and he's really good at making arguments and just thinking very robustly. So it's a great honor to have him. And specifically today, we were trying to think of what we should talk about with Chris, and we realized theology is a very important part of philosophy, because if you have a theological framework, then that should be your ultimate. That should frame your purpose, and that should frame all your other ideas in philosophy. So maybe let's start by Chris. Just tell us a bit about yourself and your journey in your faith, in your theological ideas.
So I was born and raised Catholic. And I was always curious. I was always asking questions about the faith and trying to learn more. And my parents were very good with that. And also my early catechism was also very good as well. And then as I got a little bit further, maybe about year 6, I identified, okay, there are 3 sort of steps you have to make to get to Catholicism. And the first would be, does God exist? The next would be, is Jesus God? Did he rise from the dead and all of that? And then the third one would be, did Jesus establish a church? And is Catholicism?
Very intellectual in year 6.
Yeah. But and so I started with, okay, let's start from the beginning. Let's go, does God exist? And so then I just played William Lane Craig debates, Christopher Hitchen, all the new atheist debates.
Yeah.
And I just listened to hours of that. And then I was sort of satisfied. I was like, okay, yeah. And then moved on into the next ones. And I think, but the main sort of trigger, I think, that really got me more interested was one time I was at a philosophy competition run by the school. And we went to another school, and there were some controversial opinions floated by me, and that didn't make me popular. And I realized I was in year 9, I think, and I was debating with year 12s on some hot topics, and that was the sort of moment where I realized, okay, I don't know as much as I think I do, because it's only as soon as you're under pressure that you realize you don't know very much, or at least you have problems with it. And so after that experience, I wondered, well, if I thought I was really experienced, well, not experienced, but I thought I was very knowledgeable, then how would most people at my school be able to handle this sort of thing? And so after that, then we established the Apologetics Club at our school. And so that's been pretty successful, but now I've learned more because of that sort of incident, where when you're put on the back foot, then you realize you don't know too much. Yeah.
So when you were watching, a lot of these new atheist debates, people like Christopher Hitchens, what sort of arguments did the theists make that really convinced you that God does exist?
Well, one of the main ones that I was attracted to immediately was this argument that if evolution is true, then you've sort of got a lot to work with. So in terms of the creation of the world, then that's already improbable. And there's the work of a British scientist, Frederick Hoyle, I think his name is. And he sort of calculated all of these ideas, he made all these calculations to see that this was how improbable it is. And then he sort of that was what made him a theist. And so I found that very convincing. And then later on, when you get to the evolutionary stage, you realize that for us, our closest, say, neighbor species, like apes or chimpanzees, are still living in the jungle and like throwing food at each other.
Yeah.
And so the fact that there's such a gap between our closest evolutionary relatives and us in terms of intellect, that's sort of, it's hard to just explain that away naturalistically. And then also you get, you know, the idea of morality from, if you look at the very beginning of mere Christianity with C.S. Lewis, his arguments about, we all feel this intrinsic morality, and if we don't have that grounded in God, that it really means nothing. I found that very convincing as well. So there's sort of the combination of those two, sort of seeing how the world is created and where we've gotten as humans, but then also looking at morality and that sort of thing that are inbuilt into us. I found that those two very, very convincing in terms of becoming theist. Well, I don't want to say theist, but proving theist.
Yeah. Okay, that's very interesting. And that's what got you to God exists.
Yeah.
In terms of, I guess Christianity, we can kind of skip that. But once you're a Christian, right? And I think this is more your expertise. So once you're a Christian, why Catholic? Why this system of authority? Why is that so important to Catholics?
So what you'd probably go to the most distinctive characteristic of Catholicism compared to Orthodox and Protestant would be the papacy. That's really if you want to distinguish between Catholicism and the other two main branches of Christianity, then the papacy is the main thing. Because with the Orthodox, we share apostolic succession and we share belief in the true presence in the Eucharist. And with Protestants, we share that we both like the Bible. But that's the most distinctive one. So I would say if you prove the papacy, or not prove, but have solid evidence for the papacy, that's what pushes you towards Catholicism.
So Chris, what do you think is the foundational piece of evidence that supports the existence of the papacy as we now know it today?
I would say you have two sources of evidence that you get to achieve the papacy, and you'd have that first biblically and then from the early church fathers. So the strongest piece of evidence, I think, from the Bible is Matthew 16:18, where, and I'll just read you the passage here, it's where Jesus says, "Peter, you are rock, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And so there's a few things you have to unpack in terms of that line. There's a bit of debate over Peter, the word Peter and the word rock in the Greek. You have Petros and then Petra, so Petros being Peter, and then on this rock is Petra. And so some Protestants will say that Petra is a really large stone and Petros is just a little pebble. And so really Jesus is making fun of Peter by saying, "You're not that significant. I'll build this church on myself, and that's the big rock." But actually that's not really, it doesn't really fit with the context. And so it really just makes sense that Peter is just you can't call a man a female version of a word. So Petra, you just make it masculine, which would be Petros.
Right.
And that's even espoused by Protestant theologians such as D.A. Carson, who said that that's the same thing. But then there's so much to unpack with this, but I think that another big one is that it mirrors the Old Testament, the Davidic kingdom. And so what you have in the Davidic kingdom is you have the king, but then you also have 12 ministers in the cabinet, and then you have the prime minister, or the chief steward.
Right.
And so if Jesus is coming to restore the Davidic kingdom, then you have Jesus as the king, you have Peter as the chief steward, and then you have the other 11. And then you also have, if you go to Isaiah 22, you can see how Jesus clearly making parallels that this is an office he's giving to Peter. It's not just like, Peter, you're a good leader, so I'm going to make you the head of the apostles. This is, so Isaiah is saying to this chief steward, the current chief steward, Shebna, who's being deposed now, God's kicking him out. And so Isaiah says to him on behalf of God, I'll depose you from your office, and you will be ousted from your position. In that day I will summon my servant Eliakim, son of Hilkiah. I will clothe him with robe and fasten your scepter around him, and hand your authority over to him. I will place on his shoulder the key to the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. So there's clearly you have the keys, same thing with what Jesus gives to Peter, and you have this very similar, what you open and close, loosen and fasten. Those are both very obvious there. So that would be the main one from the Bible. And then just quickly, from Irenaeus, which is one of the early church fathers, and in his book, chapter 3 of Against Heresies, he says that you should submit to Rome for it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority. So that's pretty, that pretty much nails down a lot of the objections against the papacy.
Right. And so you mentioned Irenaeus, of course, as one of probably one of the oldest church fathers to talk about heresies, from my understanding, and how he submits to Rome, right? But from what I've researched about what the Orthodox position is, a lot of Orthodox Christians believe that, yes, of course, you have some church fathers that hold the papacy as supreme. For them, there are almost equally as many church fathers that didn't see the papacy as the supreme authority over all of Christianity. So, for example, I have this excerpt from a book called the two ways, I think, the two paths. Basically, it's from an Orthodox scholar, and he basically recounts a incident in which I'll just read you the whole thing. In August 430, Pope Cleistine held a synod in Rome in which he condemned Nestorius. Cleistine then wrote to Cyril, Patriarch of Alexandria, informing him of the results of the council and authorizing Cyril, quote, the authority of our see having been combined with yours and acting authoritatively in our stead. Cyril called a council at Alexandria in which he issued a synodal letter in the name of both Rome and Alexandria to Nestorius. If Cyril recognizes Rome's supreme authority, why does he call a council and issue a synodal letter in the name of both churches? Basically, the claim being made here is, if the whole conceit of the Catholic Church is you have this very strict hierarchical structure, right, in which you have the Pope in Rome who presides over all other Catholics, and his word is final, right? And he's already had the council to condemn Nestorius, this heretic. Why then does he then give the authority to a different patriarch in Alexandria to have a council of his own, in order to confirm that, yes, we are condemning Nestorius? It seems that it sets up this dichotomy of this shared power between the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Alexandria. What do you make of all that?
Okay, so first of all, I'm not familiar with that, but from what I can gather, there is authority given to the bishops of their area, of their diocese, that the Pope can actually not really infringe on, because that's their right as the bishop of that area.
Yeah.
But those are mainly sort of prudential judgments. So, for example, if a Nestorian heresy in that particular diocese, which is it Pope Cyril is writing to?
Patriarch of Alexandria, Cyril. So the patriarch. Okay,
so the Patriarch of Alexandria. If Nestorianism was particularly rampant in that area, right, then the Pope might give him, say, have another council over there. But you're just confirming what we've already said.
Yeah.
So the fact that he already made a decision, and he's not just saying, well, you come to a decision and then we'll talk.
Mm-hmm.
He's basically saying, well, you affirm what I'm saying, but you do it within your own power.
Right.
And then you show that to the rest of your diocese.
Right. So what you're kind of saying is, within this hierarchical structure of early Christianity, you have the Pope who makes the decision first and foremost. that judgment is not being questioned in that second council among the Eastern patriarchs. What is being discussed in that second council is how to properly handle the condemning of this heresy.
Well, for example, you can also see that with Peter. So, for example, in Acts, you have the Council of Jerusalem, the first one, and so what happens there is they're trying to figure out: do we include the Gentiles in the new church? Do they have to be circumcised, or do they have to be Jews? Then Peter gets up, and he says, I don't have the exact thing in front of me, but he basically says that yes, they can. And then it says the assembly fell silent when he finished speaking.
Yep.
And then James, who is the patriarch, who's the bishop of Jerusalem at the time, he gets up, and then he doesn't challenge Peter, but he sort of makes a prudential judgment. As the bishop of Jerusalem, he says, well, this is how we're going to sort of work with this new ruling. This is how we're going to do it. So he's not undermining Peter's authority by saying, he says basically that Gentiles who become Christian should try not to eat food that's been sacrificed to other gods and that sort of thing, because it might cause scandal among the Jewish brethren. And so he's making prudential judgments. He's not undercutting Peter, because Peter's already made his decision as the Pope among them. But then James is just making his little side comment as a prudential judgment because he's the Bishop of Jerusalem.
So you're saying like that extra added little bit that James adds is not, it's not contradicting Peter. It's a side point because he is the Bishop of Jerusalem, because he has this experience or this proximity to the Jewish community. He knows what should be added to that doctrine. Okay, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Now, taking a step back a bit, because I feel like, this is really good, but this is more the nitpicky stuff.
Yeah.
But taking a step back, many Protestants especially would say, how can a system, like a man-made system, not man-made for Catholics, but how can a system consisting of men are flawed, how can men make decisions? They'll often look at things like the Assumption of Mary, the Immaculate Conception, these sort of dogmas, which have been made relatively recently. And they'll say, like, how do men have authority to do this? How would you explain that?
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of those recent developments, those are usually the ones that come under a bit more fire.
Yeah.
Because they're more recent, and so it's further away from the initial, Jesus, and then it's less obvious. But the main thing is that, where did Jesus give authority? And if he gave authority to this guy, the Pope, then we should accept that authority that's been given to him. So even if it is men who make mistakes, and that is something that I think is also an objection, is what about bad popes and that sort of thing. But it's mainly if authority's been given by Jesus to the apostles who passed them down, and then one specific apostle, Peter, then that really shows that we should be following that guy because Jesus said so. Yeah, so it's not about, they never act of their own accord in a way. They do in certain circumstances they don't, and those are the ones where that really matter. In terms of speaking infallibly and that sort of thing, they don't speak on their own authority. They speak of the authority of Jesus behind them.
And so one more thing, there's been historically bad popes, just morally bad popes. At least in the public eye, you can say they've done terrible things. How would you account for that? How would you sort of reconcile with that as a Catholic? And does that affect the church and how it functions? Is there ever a point where corruption can take over the church? Or does simply being a Catholic mean that it's not possible, or that it is possible, but even if church leadership corrupts, you should still stick to it? How does that sort of thing work?
Well, when we look at the medieval popes, for example, one of the most notorious ones would be Benedict IX, who had a family and did all sorts of terrible stuff. when you look at the sort of medieval popes that were more worldly, or even more modern popes, if you think they've done something wrong, the bad popes don't disprove the papacy, because if Jesus meant for the papacy to sort of, if it was so fragile that it could be taken over by these bad people, then I don't think he would give the authority of God behind it. Because the fact is, even when you look at all across history, if you have all these corrupt popes, none of them have ever infallibly claimed something contradictory. They've never proclaimed doctrine that contradicts, even though they probably could have to get themselves off the hook morally. They didn't. And so that's almost a proof. The bad popes almost become a proof for Catholicism rather than acting against it. Yeah.
So the idea is that, like, when Jesus said, Peter, I will build this and my church on you, basically, and he gives him the keys to the kingdom of heaven. The keys don't grant Peter to speak infallibly in all cases, right? My understanding is when popes say something, not everything that they say is infallible. It's only when they speak in the chair ex cathedra that they are basically enshrining doctrine. And so you're saying is that the actions of these bad popes, they are not a part of Christian doctrine. It's only the action of the pope that, when they are not, exercising their personal life, but only working within the whole system of the church, that really matters.
Yeah, exactly. So they're sort of private, even in their just, if they say things around religion or do things around religion that are actually wrong, or for example, John Paul II kissed the Quran in a sort of very reverential way.
Yeah,
that would be, you might consider that wrong because he's giving credence to a false religion, but that doesn't invalidate the papacy, because he's not saying I infallibly, as the Pope, declare this.
He's kissing the Quran as John Paul II, not Pope John Paul II.
Yeah, basically.
Okay. Earlier, I think you mentioned that you say that the Pope is the linchpin of Catholicism. Could you just expand on what you really mean by that? Like, how is it that a singular person is so important to the whole functioning of a whole religion, world religion, today?
Right. Okay. So when you see the other Christian denominations, the two other ones, when you look at Protestantism, it's fractionating like every 3 seconds. Yeah. So some people say there's like some 5,000 churches. I don't think that's quite right, but it is.
I think there's like 30,000.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, so I'm not sure about the number, but it does split up because everyone becomes their own little pope. In effect, they decide their own doctrine and that sort of thing. And so, but if you have no one to, obviously Jesus is not currently with us teaching and that sort of thing. And also, as you look into the Bible, you're not going to get clear-cut answers to absolutely every moral problem that comes up. And so when you have a new moral problem or a new doctrine that's developing, you still have to have someone who can decide what's right and wrong here. And that actually leads to some problems for Protestants, for example, because if it's not in the Bible, what are they supposed to do? They can try and make some stuff up, but they just basically have to say, we don't know. And so you don't have an infallible leader to say, this is what's right and this is what's wrong. Then how do you know the heretics from the true church? And even among the Orthodox, you have a similar sort of split. Some patriarchs won't talk to each other. I know the Russians have some beef with some other.
Oh yeah, the Russians split with the Constantinople patriarch in 2018 or something.
Yeah, so there's, if you don't have one person to, and this is actually seen across the Bible. God never appoints a group to do the work. That's never been the structure of the kingdoms he set up. He had Abraham, he had Moses, he had the leaders who go into, and then they lead the nation or their tribe or the entire church towards doing things. It's never just a group. So it's very it does fulfill the Old Testament, and that's why it's important to have the one leader.
And I think that's a very important point, because I feel that a lot of Christians make a separation between Old and New Testament, which there should be a separation, of course, but they make a separation to the point where the Old Testament might be neglected, and they don't realize that the church is, the New Jerusalem, the new kingdom of David. And, when you look at it through that lens, your point of view is much more acceptable. So, yeah.
Well, I'll just play Protestant's advocate for a little bit. So you mentioned that, like, Protestants, they only have the Bible, sola scriptura, right? And so if something comes up that they don't find in the Bible, they don't find answers in the Bible, they don't really know what to do because they don't have an infallible leader. I think the objection to that would be, well, you say the Pope, right? He has the ability to speak infallibly, but when he speaks infallibly, he has to draw that conclusion, that judgment from somewhere. And more often than not, or in most, if not all cases, that infallible judgment is drawn from the Bible. So what makes the Pope specifically, like, having the ability to discern scripture better than any other person who's well read or, well educated in the Bible, the study of the Bible?
Okay, so why would you trust the Pope over any other, like a pastor or any sort of leader who can just read the Bible? The Pope doesn't just draw on the Bible in terms of their judgment, but then also you have a Bible passage, say, then if you look at it, there are many different ways to interpret it. For example, when I brought up that Petros, Petra, how do you decide what it means? And if you don't have someone who can actually interpret it infallibly, then you get multiple different answers to it. And so that's what happens exactly, is people become their own Pope, Protestants become their own Pope, and say, this is what my interpretation of this verse is. So you actually need an infallible interpreter in order to say, well, this is what this actually means. But also, the church does leave room for disagreement and debate on certain passages or on certain ideas which haven't quite yet been settled.
Right.
Yeah.
And so where do you think this infallibility, this ability of the Pope to tap into infallible judgment, do you think that's like a product of like the Holy Spirit or something? Like, is that the explanation, the Catholic explanation?
Yeah, the Catholic explanation would be that it's because of the Holy Spirit's guidance that the Pope doesn't err in this judgment. But also another point is that for the Protestants, how do they actually know what canon of Scripture they should accept as the Bible? So even for them to get the Bible, they have to have some sort of way to figure that out. And if it's not infallible, then you're really playing with fire a bit, because some books you're not really sure. But then also, we sort of put the Bible together. The ecumenical councils put it together, infallibly declared which ones were in it. Then they took some out, but they still keep some of the canon in. So they have to be careful in terms of, well, where do you actually get it from?
I think that's a great point. I think a lot of Protestants may say that they recognize the early councils, obviously Council of Nicaea, the early creeds even. Most would say that. But then they'll say, in around this time, the church became corrupted and wasn't what Jesus intended, or something like that. So what would you say to that point of view?
Right. Okay. So actually, going back to Matthew 16:18, when Jesus says, "And the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church." Now, some Protestants will interpret that as, the gates of death, like won't, because he's triumphed over death, so that's fine. But actually, when you look at Saint Jerome, who lived in the 400s, I believe, he says, "I suppose the gates of hell to mean vice and sin, or at least the doctrines of heretics, by which men are ensnared and drawn into hell." So if he's saying the church, which will be headed by Peter, will never fall under the doctrine of heretics, by which men are ensnared and drawn into hell, then that's the test for you then is, for a Protestant would be, how can I undermine that? And you have to find a way where you maybe had the Pope lead us in a different direction, which was clearly wrong. And they would say that that's just all the time. They would say the medieval ages probably. But if you have a church backed by God who says that it will never err, then you sort of have to believe that.
Right. I think one more argument for a Protestant would be, the idea of the introduction of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception as infallible dogma, right? I believe in the 1800s, something around that, more modern, more modern innovation, let's say. I've heard a Protestant argument, which is, let's say that the Pope is infallibly speaking, that yes, there was the Immaculate Conception. But then the argument goes is that there are saints that have lived, died, and been canonized before the introduction of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, that didn't believe in the Immaculate Conception, right? So there are saints who, in their homilies or in their writings, said that they believe that Mary had indeed sinned at some point, right? And then they say, but those saints retain their ability to be saints and be in heaven forever. Right, even though that they are contradicting what should be a universal dogmatic truth about theology, right? What would you say to that sort of argument, right?
Yeah. Okay, so we know that the saints aren't infallible. So even St. Thomas Aquinas was briefly excommunicated after his death because he was espousing ideas. There was a French school of theological thought where he was. And I'm not familiar entirely with it, but he was part of that movement. He was sort of espousing it. And then the church said, no, that's heresy. And then if you continue that, you're under pain of excommunication. But he had died before they had issued that. Then he was excommunicated briefly, and they brought him back in because he was...
And he became a saint.
And he became a saint.
So
and they actually canonized him briefly afterwards.
Come back, sort of.
Yeah. So saints can be wrong. And the idea of people do get nervous, especially the Orthodox as well as the Protestants, about later developments. We'd say there's no new revelation, but there's a development of doctrine.
Yeah.
But then also you don't just see these just randomly appear. Suddenly the Pope says, okay, now I've got the Immaculate Conception. There's usually tradition behind it, and that you could see that with the Immaculate Conception. But also if they have the power... If the Pope has the power to infallibly define things, that's sort of the thing. It's as soon as you have the Pope and you say it's infallible, then that's it. But with later doctrines, even papal infallibility wasn't declared until I think the 1800s as well. So then that makes everyone suspicious, like, oh, they're just making it up so they can sing really good. But we didn't infallibly define Jesus's personhood as the second person of the Trinity until hundreds of years after he died.
Right.
So generally the church's system is as soon as people start to attack the idea, that's when we infallibly declare it. But as soon as everyone,
Sorry. I think that's a great... Sorry, you finish first.
Yeah. So the reason it was declared then, the infallibility was declared then, was because in the heat of the Enlightenment, you had all these European monarchs that were falling away from the church. And then that's basically the Pope saying, look, I'm not powerful because of you guys. I'm powerful because God gives me the power to infallibly declare things. And so that's why that was issued then, because it wasn't really under fire during medieval times. And so, and in fact, it's almost a testament that it was not challenged previously.
Right. So you're saying that, infallible claims aren't that, the one day the Pope woke up and he's like, I think Mary was born of Immaculate Conception. It's more, this is a tradition that's been held for, thousands of years or whatever. And then, right now, it's under fire. So let me clarify it. And
generally, but also if the actual doctrine just develops tradition along tradition. But there's always elements of, there's arguments to it, and I think they're very strong arguments for the Immaculate Conception.
Yeah.
That stand alone. It's not just the Pope saying everyone. There's no reasons. Just I say it.
Yeah.
There's always reasons.
And I think when you brought up the debate on Jesus's personhood, which was not defined until a couple hundred years later, I think that's a great parallel because we kind of take it for granted sometimes. Like, this is just how it is. Christians believe in the Trinity. Jesus is God and man. We take that for granted. But that was actually a thing that like really divided Christians, or really divided people who believe in Jesus.
Technically quite fun.
They're not Christians. But yeah, so even that we take for granted, but that needed the church to clarify something that we now think is such a truth that everyone should know, every Christian should know. So yeah, I think that's a great example. I think, you're bringing up some great arguments. In terms of, this might be a bit of a curveball. What do you think we should learn from Protestants or other denominations?
I think in terms of the Protestants, I think we can keep our music. But they read the Bible very well, and they take the Bible very seriously because that's the only source, infallible source they say they have. Then I think it's good for Catholics to take the Bible more with more, intentionality and read it more often, because even as I was going through the Bible in a year with Father Mike Smith, which everyone should do, you'd never know some of these stories just from like going around normally as a Catholic, unless you actually read the Bible. And that's why Catholics often get trounced by Protestants, because they know all their scripture back to front, and we're sort of like, well, was it Matthew or Luke who said that? And so then I think we should learn to read our Bibles more from the Protestants.
I think you mentioned just then about how Catholics sometimes get a bit trounced by Protestants because they know their scripture. This is just a random thought that pops in my head, but I often see there's a lot more Protestant apologists out there than Catholic apologists, and I wonder if it has to do with the fact that Protestant apologists tend to be more popular because they can quote more of the Bible, right? Because when you're speaking to an a-religious person who doesn't care about the magisterium or doesn't really understand why early church father teachings are so important, what they do know is that Christianity is from the Bible in the same way that the Quran is the origin of Islam. And so they're going to look to, or they're going to debate people who know the source text the best. And I think that's perhaps why you see the most popular apologists tend to be Protestant. So look at your Cliff
Nechtel.
Yeah, Cliff Nechtel or whatever. Even though we may see them as being a bit theologically behind,
I think those guys are great though. They're really doing a lot of good.
I think that they do a lot of good for bringing people to Christianity in general, and they know their Bible very well, but then they miss out on some of the nuances of true Catholicism. I mean, they're Protestant, so of course they don't touch on the church father stuff, but they know the Bible really well, right? And I think that appeals to people who are a-religious, who aren't familiar with, the amount of information that is possible. They just know, okay, the Bible I know it should be authoritative for sure.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it also does appeal to a Western audience more because there's less rules involved in read the Bible and have a relationship with Jesus. That's all I really want you to do, man.
Yeah.
So if you do, because then it's less. Many would see that the Catholic Church's position on many moral issues to be very constraining, especially to modern sensibilities.
Yeah.
But then in Protestantism, you have a lot more room because you can sort of find, if you don't like what a particular pastor is saying, then you decide in your wisdom as the infallible interpreter of the Bible to go somewhere else because you don't like what they're saying. So it gives you that room. I'm not saying everyone would do that, but that it is very appealing in that sort of way, Protestantism over Catholicism, because there's less rules that you can get entangled in.
And there's the classic dictum, relationship, not religion.
Yeah. I think Cliff Nechtel and that sort of thing. He's one of those people who are very much, I don't care what denomination you are. I just care that you love Jesus and follow his law and that sort of thing.
I think it's because that phrase is so popular because there's a little bit of a stigma around organized religion right now, because people see it as, a rise of, extremism and dogmatic ideological conformity and stuff like that. Whereas a relationship seems, as you said, it's more freeing, it's more easygoing, and people like that. People like it's more easy and freeing. I think we are coming to the end of the episode here. Just to finish off, if you could just tell us, what is like one message that you would like to tell the audience at home? Like, what's one key takeaway that you wish that more people could know?
I think it's read more into, I think apologetics is a very good field to get into. Not field, but sort of more research into that, because if you don't know enough to just tell someone the basic arguments for why you believe what you believe, do you actually know enough to say you believe it? Because if I'm not saying you have to go into the Greek and figure out everything like that, but just, do you have the basic sort of means to say, this is why someone should believe it? Because if you don't have those, then you don't really have a good reason to believe it yourself.
Yeah, and I love that, because that's kind of why Raph and I started this podcast. Because, we could have just said like, oh, we're no experts, we're just young people, we have no idea what we're talking about, which is true. But sure, people can say that, can criticize us for that. But if we believe something, and you can't explain it, you can't say it on camera, then is it worth anything? Is it really, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. Like, what's the strength of your conviction if you can't at all back it up at all, right? So I think it's really important to learn about your beliefs and the underlying reasons and for why you believe what you believe.
Yeah, it's also about evangelization as well, because as we were talking about earlier, because Jesus calls you as a Christian to evangelize to all the nations. And so if you don't know why someone else should believe in it, and then you're going to come up against, especially because it's very easy to object to something than to explain the reason for it.
For sure.
And so if you're not ready for why does God allow evil in the world, then you're going to get stumped, and then you're not going to be able to convince as many people of your position. And evangelize to more people.
Because that's why you become convinced of something. You have reasons to believe that, right? So if you, as a Christian, don't have the reasons in your head already about why you believe what you believe, how are you going to transfer or persuade that to another person who might be agnostic or atheist? But I think this was a very insightful conversation. Thank you for coming on the show. If anyone in the audience has any questions, please leave them down below, or any comments, queries, qualms.
Thank you so much. Raph and I have learned a lot from hearing you talk. It's been a very enjoyable conversation. And we'd love to have you on in some time in the future. Sure. And just remember, you're our first guest, so that's awesome.
I get a trophy.
You get a trophy. Yes. Well, we won't show that on camera. It's not real.
Definitely be the most important achievement of his life. Nothing else will happen. Thank you.